Hi there and welcome. My name is Chaplain Gale J. Yandell, and I'm the Director of Training Development for the International Fellowship of Chaplains. I am excited that you are joining me today for my brand new series on unforgiveness. Oh, I know, not one of our most favorite topics, but I have a lot to say, and I really think that we can all learn something about forgiveness. The first part of this series is an explanation of forgiveness. The second part is the impact of unforgiveness, and then the good stuff, the freedom of forgiveness. So thank you so much for joining me for part one, an exploration of forgiveness. So recently, I was watching a well-known preacher on TV, and they made the comment that as they traveled all over the world to teach and preach, they made it a practice to ask their audience this question: how many of you are angry at someone? And they followed that question with, how many of you would say that your anger and pain have turned into unforgiveness? And as the cameras panned across the enormous audience, I was quite surprised at how many people had their hands in the air. In fact, I would venture to say that at least 75% of the audience had their hand raised. Now, I'm making an assumption here that many, if not most of these people, were born-again believers. The speaker went on to say that this was pretty much the case everywhere they went. And I thought to myself, whew, been there, done that. I've been angry at someone, and I allowed that pain and anger to turn into unforgiveness. I wonder if that's ever happened to you. I wonder if you can relate. Well, this led me to start thinking about the cost and impact of anger and unforgiveness. I think that all of us would say it's important to handle our anger, hurt, and pain immediately so that it doesn't turn into hatred, rage, or unforgiveness. But what about when it does? What about when that initial hurt or slight or wound turns into unforgiveness towards another person or a place or a thing? Then what? So that's what I want to talk about. In the first part, I want to explore what unforgiveness means and what it looks like. In the second part, I'll talk about how it impacts us physically, mentally, and spiritually. And in the third part, we'll look to God's Word for solutions, and I will offer tools on a process of unforgiveness. If you know me, then you know I am a definitions kind of girl. So in order for all of us to be on the same page, let's look at an actual definition of forgiveness. Unforgiveness is defined as a state of emotional and mental distress that results from a delayed response in forgiving an offender. In other words, we didn't let it go immediately. We held on to it. It's characterized by indignation, bitterness, and a demand for punishment or restitution. Unforgiveness creates a domino effect that negatively impacts every part of us, including our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors, our body, our spirit, and our relationships. In the case of unforgiveness, time does not heal all wounds, and in fact, time makes it worse. Unforgiveness is like carrying around a huge weight. The longer we carry a grudge, the heavier the burden becomes. In the absence of a timely response, the roots of unforgiveness only go deeper, further entangling us. In other words, feeding on unforgiveness is toxic. What does unforgiveness look like? Nelson Mandela said hating someone is drinking poison and expecting the other person to die from it. I've often thought that unforgiveness is like swallowing a mean dog because it will spend the rest of its life chewing its way out of you. Unforgiveness creates an emotional storm of distress in which feelings of anxiety, depression, stress, insecurity, and fear are all brought to the surface. Unforgiveness also creates a hardened heart. A hard heart feels anger, resentment, bitterness, and hatred toward the offender, and negative emotions can overtake us when we see that person who hurt us, or even when we hear their name. And by the way, I say the person, but the offender could be a place or a thing. I actually know several people who hold unforgiveness for the events of 9/11. No judgment here. I'm simply using the word person in regard to unforgiveness for ease of conversation, with the understanding an offender could be a person, place, or thing. I think it's fair to say that unforgiveness can become all-consuming. It has a way of infecting every aspect of our lives. As the saying goes, it causes us to bleed on those who didn't cut us. Unforgiveness takes up a lot of mental space. It is as if the person who hurt us is living rent-free in our heads and in our hearts. We replay that unfair situation over and over again. Like an old movie reel, we analyze each clip of the injustice. We write scripts in our mind detailing what we will say in a confrontation with the offender. Perhaps we daydream about how to get even. Now, here's the bad news about all of that. When we ruminate on an offense, a snowball effect occurs. Not only do we dwell on the current offense, but research supports that we might even start mentally digging up past events in our lives and use them as fuel to make a case for the current hurt. In other words, we review every hurt, every slight, every offense as fuel to justify our current position, which is one who holds unforgiveness. We start to feel trapped and consumed by our own negative thoughts, unable to stop the runaway train. So what's the result of all of this? Pain becomes our identity. Unforgiveness impacts our judgment and perspective because our view of the world is now seen through the lens of hurt. We perceive every wrong we encounter as a personal offense against us. A sensitivity toward rejection starts to develop, and instead of assuming good intent from others, we harden our heart and start living in a mindset of protection against yet another offense. And then pain becomes the identity of the unforgiving person. Unforgiveness affects our character and our integrity. I think it's fair to say that grudges don't bring out the best in us. We complain to our friends about the person who offended us. We may start to exaggerate the details of the story in order to gain sympathy and supporters. Perhaps we give the offender the silent treatment, or ignore them completely, or just have a bad attitude when we're around them. Maybe we look for opportunities to throw things up in their face or silently rejoice when something doesn't go right for them. Maybe we withhold love as a punishment. Unforgiveness can't be contained. It spreads like a cancer and strains all of our relationships. For example, our spouse or coworkers may be tired of hearing the same story over and over and over and over again. So people start avoiding us because of our negative and bitter attitude. Unforgiveness may have made us irritable, causing us to treat others poorly. It's hard to love others when we have hate in our hearts. Our feelings of distrust might make it difficult for us to connect with people. We may start to withdraw in order to protect ourselves from being hurt again. Unforgiveness can warp us into people we don't even recognize. It has the ability to make us a little meaner, a little less open to others, and a little more cynical. And the worst part of unforgiveness? Now the evil one has a foothold. Whew, that's a lot. What person wants to admit to all of that? I think it takes a great deal of courage to be willing to look at the aspects of this issue and say, is this me? To add to the mix, what Christian wants to admit to all of this? Well, it happens. We as Christians can find ourselves in the unforgiveness trap. But our exploration is not finished. We have to swim through a few more waves before we get to the good stuff. I hope you will join me for part 2 in this series, The Cost of Unforgiveness, where I will discuss how this issue impacts us physically, mentally, and spiritually. But don't be discouraged. Hope is coming. In part 3, the freedom of forgiveness, we'll look to God's Word and we'll share some tools for healing. We might be in the trap, but with the Father's help, we don't have to stay there. I hope you will join me for Series 2, The Impact of Unforgiveness. Thank you.